Hello, everyone, and welcome to Health and Happiness at Work. This podcast is for busy working adults trying to figure out how to better take care of themselves and others. My name is Katy, and I will be your host. We are here today because adulting is hard and because busy working adults spend more time at work than anywhere else. We're going to have real conversations about real life and, most importantly, swing into action on the biggest opportunities. We're going to talk about ways to layer health, fitness, and wellness directly into your workday so that you feel fantastic. I cannot wait to dive deeper into each of these topics related to health and happiness. You are not alone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 5 of Health and Happiness at Work. And I am here with two colleagues from Wellness Collective, Jessica Lewis and Lara Uher, and you will meet them in just a moment. We are going to be exploring a variety of topics today, particularly topics like grief, navigating loss and change, and restorative strategies. I think this will be a relevant episode for a variety of situations. But before we get into that and supporting your health and well-being at work, let's meet our guests today. So I'll start with, they don't know which one I'm going to start with. They're like a little nervous. Let's go with Jessica first. Jessica, tell everybody a little bit about your background and anything else you think that's relevant to today's conversation.
Thank you, Katy. Yes, I first started as a Reiki practitioner in 2008, but it wasn't until after my daughter's cancer diagnosis and other things that came to be that I ended up going the level of going for my yoga 200-hour training. And now I've become more of a trauma-informed yoga educator, mainly working in public schools, also in a couple of psychiatric facilities, and then also for you, of course. So I feel like this is an important conversation to have. A lot of the time, people are carrying grief and loss around without feeling like they have a place to really be heard or understood on what it is they need. So hopefully this will be helpful for that.
Yeah, awesome. All right, Lara, you're up next. Some people may have heard your background before, but just in case.
Yes. So I'm Lara, and I'm a mental health specialist with Wellness Collective. I'm a licensed independent social worker. So like Jessica, I used to work in schools for almost about 20 years with kiddos with special needs. And now I have like a part-time private practice with Wellness Collective. I see clients mainly focusing on trauma treatment using neuroscience and attachment theory. And I also develop content presentations for Wellness Collective on really anything mental health. And I do that with corporations, businesses, organizations around Central Ohio and beyond. What I've experienced with working with clients, specifically with trauma, is that grief is always there. Sometimes they don't realize that it is grief, and we have to kind of increase awareness of that so that they can heal and restore from that.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So let me just walk everyone through why we're here today and kind of my thought process.
Yeah.
So it's been my experience that different times of year or different seasons of life or different major life events will stir up a variety of emotions. And as we all know, some emotions are exciting and happy and loving and epic. And some emotions are like, oh, what do I do with this? And I feel kind of icky or I feel kind of off, and we have to process those. And so I know in my own life, I've had the experience of like the letdown effect, where there's some major event, some culminating something that maybe I've been anticipating and looking forward to. And sometimes it's a positive thing. Sometimes it's just a stressful or demanding thing. And then I have that letdown effect afterwards where I almost feel sick or slightly down or depressed. So I've had to navigate that over the years. And so I got thinking about that. I think about the holidays, again, even major events like a wedding or something. And if you've had some type of loss or change or something unexpected happen, how those moments can be really difficult. And then that had me also thinking about change. People are oftentimes change adverse, even though by nature, biological beings change and adapt, and change is inevitable if you're a living, breathing being. So these are the types of topics that I think people are navigating. And what Lara and I talk about a lot is that when you are working through something, it's not like you're only working through it in your personal life.
Right.
Oftentimes, you're working through it socially, you're working through it professionally, you're working through whatever it is you're handling or processing in many domains of life, as we call it.
Mm-hmm.
So, those are some of the reasons why I thought, hey, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what we have maybe experienced ourselves. Let's talk about what we've seen with all the different age groups we work with. All three of us, actually, fun fact, all three of us have worked in schools in different capacities in terms of health, fitness, well-being, mental health. All three of us also work with workplaces. So I think the conversation we'll have today can be really diverse in the sense we work one-on-one with folks, we work with younger populations, we work with special populations,
Mm-hmm.
and we get to step into a lot of different people's lives. So hopefully it normalizes the conversation on some things.
Right.
And then, as always in these episodes, after we have some conversation about the topic at hand, we always want to shift into solutioning, strategies, and ways to heal and support, not only individually, but how do we then also take it into our niche, which is the workplace? What can workplaces do to help people to heal?
Right.
Just a few things, to get through today. So let's talk first about grief. Based on what I know and what I've learned, there's not one type, there's many.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most recent article I read identified 16 types of grief. So we will not go there today,
Right.
but I think if we were to oversimplify what grief is, it's some type of loss.
Yeah.
And typically it's loss related to a loved one, but we could widen that definition. And there are many different types of loss, right? Like you have this anticipation or expectation of how things are going to be or
Yeah.
play out, and then they don't, or you receive some news that it is the exact opposite of what you were hoping or intending for. So let's talk a little bit about that. Maybe some of the types of grief that you've either experienced or witnessed, and kick it off there.
I think one of the most common things that I've experienced personally, and then also within the people I work with privately in private group work for grief and loss, is that feeling that it's not just, the person that they lost. It's also whatever they had in their mind as their future and that immediate plan that they had. So for some people, and that loss, it might not be that significant. Maybe they only had a year or so that they in their mind with what they expected yearly with that person.
Right.
But if it's something that you've envisioned, the next decade of your life with that person, then you may experience loss at each stage of your life when you are at that point without that person. So it's actually called, the loss, the future loss, or expectation loss. So that one to me just stands out as a very common, and it's very berating to the person experiencing it because they blame themselves for that experience in their mind, basically.
Right.
And then in life, we often are going through even the same physical spaces or places, and then we do experience those flashbacks of time. So that's something that can feel very unnerving that, you didn't, and especially when you're maybe not expecting it to all of a sudden be at a different time in your mind, like it's happening right then, and experiencing those sensations of loss or sadness or, panic or fear, like they're happening right now again. So that's probably the most common, more like, defined kind of, line going off of grief that people don't really think about is the loss of what you didn't ever get from the future or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
So to elaborate on what Jessica was saying and these different types of grief, I've heard or I understand that there are sometimes more complicated experiences of grief, meaning that it's chronic or prolonged. Sometimes it's delayed because inevitably people stuff down what they're feeling a little bit. I've also heard about absent grief, which it's extremely prolonged and the person hasn't been able to make space to heal. And I think a powerful word that will come up more than once today is this idea of healing. And I don't think we talk about healing enough in our culture. I think we talk a lot about labeling things, like what is it that I'm experiencing and what do I call it? And I think that our healthcare industry is good at naming things. But what's harder, I think, sometimes is healing from things. So, Lara, could you talk a little bit about the power of talking to someone in the process of healing? I've
Right.
also done quite a bit of reading about the power of writing and
Mhm.
other therapeutic practices. So let's talk a little bit about healing as it relates to grief.
Okay. Well, I take a lot of my work from David Kessler. He is a researcher and therapist on grief. And he identified that there's really no prescribed way to grieve and there's no timeline. So a lot of times we feel shame and guilty when we still struggle with grief, even if it's been 2 years, 3 years, 4 years after it has happened. So I think that it's really important for people to know that what they experience through the grieving cycle is completely normal, and that it's really hard for people when they have family members, friends who encourage them that why aren't you just over it already? Because then that makes them feel like their experiences are bad or that they're not doing it correctly. So I
Their
think,
fault.
yes.
Yeah.
So I think at first you just have to kind of open it up to like everybody's experiences are their own and that there's no prescription or timeline of getting over grief. Kind of on the flip side, I work with a lot of clients that have experienced like a loss of a child, and they report that it's not really healing, that it's adjusting. So that they're still kind of in the adjustment phase of kind of working through that experience. And then there is a model called the dual process of coping, and it identifies that there's a loss-oriented side to grief and a restorative-oriented side of grief. And then every day we can oscillate through the loss-oriented side of grief and the restorative-oriented side of grief, and just to identify what that looks like and to be open to that oscillation back and forth. So I think that that's part of healing, of just like going through the process of being aware of what's going on, of being open to what's going on, and not try to feel like we have to be at a certain or at a different place, and kind of work with that.
Right. And acknowledging that it's not a static
Right.
thing. Like you
Right.
start here and then you move here.
Right.
And we see that with other things related to human behavior. It's not a linear thing where
Right.
everybody goes through the same process in the same order at the same time. I like the word oscillate.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic experience where
Right.
each day might be a little different.
Yeah, and it's not even a stage. And I know that they have like the 5 stages of grief, which I mean you can that's helpful in terms of getting knowledge and information, but that it's more of a like a ping pong back and forth.
But I always forget that not everyone knows that the 5 stages of grief were not written for people getting over someone dying. They were actually written for someone accepting their own diagnosis of a loss, like of their own life.
Oh.
So when you were first experiencing like a diagnosis of a deadly disease, that's when that was written. That's what's really interesting. I always forget,
Right.
not everyone knows that. So to be told like you should be over that and then to this new stage of acceptance, grief is not linear.
Yeah.
So we're not at a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 done situation, and when you go back into those times of life where you are an older age and maybe you look back on it or you reflect on something like when you did lose someone that was the same age that you are now, for example, people
Right.
have that experience like, oh,
Right.
now I'm 47, he was 47, and it's a new way of looking at it then. So it never really changes, it's never really gone, but it just adapts and changes with your experience as a human being,
Right.
Mm-hmm. And Laura brought up something that I think is also important that we touch on. I think with anything in life, there could be a spectrum of experiences. As an example, if you were to lose someone who's 100 years old,
Mm-hmm.
you might actually have an experience of peace that that person lived a full life. Wow,
Right.
that's amazing. Maybe there's a situation where someone's suffering.
Right.
So everyone is at peace with this transition. And we know that if we check the facts, people don't live forever.
Mm-hmm.
So
It's true.
it's a little bit more
Not
expected.
even me, Katy.
Not even you.
I know.
I know.
You're superwoman.
I've looked into it. I'm still looking.
So there are times where it's expected.
Right.
Like
Mhm.
it's expected. And there
Right.
are times where it is completely shocking
Yeah.
and technically traumatic.
Right.
So in preparing for today, I was thinking about trauma and grief and the relationship between the two.
Right.
And so I think it's important that we acknowledge in the spectrum of grief, there are scenarios where it is compounded by a traumatic event
Right.
that is completely unexpected and shocking, and therefore that healing process, like as you mentioned, is not necessarily the same healing
Right.
that someone else might be able to experience. Like you said, it's more of an acceptance, processing
Right.
what life is now like.
Yeah.
So as we kind of teed it up at the beginning of the session, sometimes we lose a person, sometimes we lose an outcome, which is not totally the same thing. Obviously,
Right.
one is, I think, significantly harder. But especially in our line of work where we step into people's workday, we
Mhm.
do see people navigating another type of loss, like they didn't, again, get the role that they applied for,
Mm-hmm.
or something has changed. So we see a lot in terms of people processing and navigating change. And it's been my experience that a workplace, for example, will talk about change management and how do we
Right.
be intentional or take care of people in the process. But sometimes I've witnessed it in such a way that there's just so much uncertainty
Mm-hmm.
and so much fear
Right.
because there's a lot of gaps, a lot of missing information. So
Mhm.
people know that change is happening, but they don't know what that means for them or
Right.
how it impacts them. We've spoken about this a little bit in the past. When the brain or the mind doesn't have all the information, it can go a million different
Yep.
places.
Creates a lot of big stories.
And so sometimes we make up stories to make sense of things,
Right.
or we catastrophize and we go to worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk a little bit about change too.
Right. So Elizabeth Kluber-Ross has a really good change model where it goes through those difficult kind of moments, more of a loss-oriented side, and then it shifts to more of a, she doesn't use the word restorative, but more like growth side where change is always an opportunity to grow. And actually, I tell my clients that if you're not uncomfortable with this process, you're not growing. So there has to be some sort of feeling of uneasiness when you're changing and growing, but that being in the uneasy is really difficult. And I think that uncertainty is very jarring. It activates the alarm system in the brain, and so that we have to find ways to, connect with others and connect with ourselves, find coping so that we can kind of manage through those difficult periods of change.
Mm-hmm.
And our brain does think 20,000 to 60,000 thoughts per day.
Right.
So that's when you're not in a manic state at all. Right. So if you were, imagine, I imagine some of the patients that I've worked with, it could be maybe 180,000 thoughts running through there if you're up for 24 hours a day. So that's the brain's job, is just to think those thoughts. So it can be very easily kind of slipped out of where you would like it to go.
Right.
And then you mentioned how we always catastrophize. Well, that's not our fault. It's actually our brain wired that way.
Yep.
It's to protect us from danger. So we don't tend to think, about we don't fantasize out the window about our dreams coming true for hours on end. It tends to be, in a second you can think of 10 things to worry about. A new mom is a perfect example of that. I always think of that of myself as a new mom. I was horrible. I mean, it didn't matter if somebody was taking her for a walk in her stroller. I pictured a white van coming up and pulling them both in there and taking them off. You know what I mean? So your brain just will do that for you.
Yeah.
and you have to know not to entertain it.
Right.
So it's natural that it happened, but we don't have to go down that path again and further
Right.
and continue. You can try to not entertain that thought. Right.
Mhm.
Or reach out to somebody if you're having a thought. Like, it's so important, that power of connection, to heal and restore, specifically through change, where you can have like one person and maybe one pet. I mean, pets are legitimately, they can be healing in and of itself, that just having somebody and telling them that they're that person. I know recently I went through something that's very change oriented, and I had 2 friends and I said, "You're on my plan." So I will
Aw.
text you. It might be 2:00 in the morning, but I need you to be there. That's powerful.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about communication. Because again, with our work in workplaces, I'll sometimes be speaking with an employee and they'll kind of share with me how difficult something at work is because of the change or because of the uncertainty or because of their thoughts, feelings, and emotions coming up. And I'll say, "Are you able to talk about it?"
Yeah.
Mm.
And sometimes the information I get back is interesting. It's like, "Well, no, what do you mean?" And I'll say, "Well, can you ask more questions? I'm curious how this will impact me. I'm curious if there's
Right.
anything more you can share with me about how this will impact my day to day. I'm feeling really uneasy. I'm sure I'm not the only one. There are thousands of employees here, but what I see is that maybe when there could be more dialogue or conversation around whatever the situation is, it's not there,
Right.
I think there's fear on both sides, because there's the employee who doesn't want to look like they can't handle,
Right.
or I'm going to get fired because I'm crying in the bathroom again. And then, there's the side of the employer being afraid to ask, just like everyone else in society,
Well,
right?
that's a good point.
Yeah. 'Cause
Because
they don't know
they
what to
don't,
a-
if
to
somebody
ask.
seems like they're doing fine, do I want to bring up this thing right now and
Right.
make them feel it and see it and hear it right in my face, or they're worried about how they'll react.
Right.
So it's fear on both sides from both.
Right.
And that's where they end up in the middle, no one doing anything. And
Right.
believe it or not, talking about it, as I say this, I need this advice myself. It is co-regulating to your nervous system,
Oh,
correct?
yes. Right.
Otherwise, we wouldn't need to talk to anyone.
Right.
We'd be fine by ourselves on an island,
Isn't it Fred Rogers who says if it's mentionable, it's manageable?
Right.
It's true.
Talking about it is massively helpful.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think we're onto something really big in this moment of this
Right.
podcast. Lara and I see it with some frequency, employers saying, "I don't know what to ask."
Right.
And then I also don't know what to do with the information they might share with me.
Or the emotions that come up.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right,
I've
because then what did they
also-
say?
Right.
I'm sorry. Have a great day. No,
Yeah.
because we have nothing else to offer you.
I also think there's
Right.
a limiting belief of, am I allowed to ask that?
Right.
Mhm.
And so Laura and I have
Right.
talked
Mhm.
about, like, you're being a human to a human. Of course you're
Right.
able
But
to
that's-
ask.
yeah,
I'm
old school was
yeah.
keeping it separated.
And
you
it's
know?
so interesting because I posed the question, is talking about feelings in the workplace unprofessional? Because that was stated to me, like, I feel very unprofessional talking about feelings. And so I posed it during a presentation, and, the room was split. One side, it was like, well, I was taught as a child that it's not okay to talk about your feelings. And then the other half, and I do think some of it is old school mentality. The other half is like, well, yeah, you have to get that out. There's such a difference between talking about feelings and oversharing. And then that gets into boundaries. Like, it just is so complex.
But I think it's all or nothing thinking
Yeah.
to say we can't or shouldn't.
Right.
Exactly.
Because there's a way to do it
Right.
that's not
Exactly.
oversharing. There's a
Right.
way to do it that's appropriate and professional.
Yeah.
I'm not
But that takes
suggesting
training too. And
Yeah,
I think
it does.
I think that that's important, where people recognize that it might just take some professional development or training to really understand the difference or what to do with it when it happens. I think that it's
Yes.
really important.
I really hope that some of what we're talking about will help individuals and groups
Right.
to not avoid this,
Yes.
but to unpack it a little bit
Right.
and work through it.
Right.
I just feel so strongly that there's a way to express what you're navigating or feeling without oversharing.
Yes.
You can say something to the effect of, I'm having a really difficult week.
Right.
And if I seem off, I am. Or if I
Right.
seem nervous or anxious, it's because I am. I feel like
Right.
I don't have enough information about what's happening with this scenario or this situation, or I'm unclear about this, that, or the other. And
Right.
there's a way to do it calmly, and there's
Yeah.
a way to do it professionally.
Mm-hmm.
And I get really passionate about this
Me too.
because I'm thinking about the new framework that came out from the Surgeon General
Yes. Yay.
talking
So excited.
about mental health and well-being in the workplace and some of the key characteristics
Mm-hmm.
and benchmarks and that type of thing. And when I saw it, I nodded emphatically yes, because not I've been saying it for a while, but like it's just so inherent in our work at Wellness
Right.
Collective. Like that's what we're built on,
Yeah.
that people feel appreciated, people feel safe, people feel respected, people look forward to going to work,
Mm-hmm.
people are able to communicate and articulate their needs in a
Right.
way that is not awkward or inappropriate or uncomfortable.
Right.
Like it's not a this or that. Like there's a way to do it. And
Right.
so I think we're onto something here, getting
Yes.
people to talk about it.
Well, and what I love about the framework is that it identified the two basic needs is safety and security. And then the entire framework is based on that. And it gets really specific into what that is, how it looks, even as specific as saying that you need to get your rest, which is fantastic because I know a lot of workplaces are like work, work, work. And so it provides such a roadmap to support healthy workplaces. And that's the thing, I think sometimes that employers, and I'm not going to get, or employees, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but if you're not in a healthy workplace, if it's somewhat toxic, then you do get into kind of a difficult situation where you can't talk about your feelings and you can't have a very healthy dialogue. And I think that that's unfortunate.
And then
Because-
sometimes even when you get the good job later, you still carry that mentality from the many years of a different kind of mindset with your employer.
Right.
So you still feel that shame of wanting to hide anything or like not wanting
Yes.
to admit when you need help or
Right.
not wanting to feel like you're milking anything, a system or wanting to make sure you're taken seriously for the next like big opportunity where they won't take into consideration like something personal that happened to you and say like, they can't handle that right now, right?
Mhm.
I mean, and then I think we all don't, nobody talks about this either, but we've all probably seen a situation in a workplace, if you've had an office job, where someone did have something happen and they did implode in the job.
Yeah.
And you saw it happen. And unfortunately, it does happen that way,
Mhm.
where they didn't get the support they needed. And a lot of the time, the employer loses out on a great person, a great employee, and they move on. A lot of people who go through a major trauma or loss, they change their whole life around. So the employer, if it's a really good employee, you don't want to lose those people
Right.
to grief or loss every time.
Right.
You want to keep them. So
Right. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and start getting into some supportive strategies, either for individuals who are navigating loss, change, etc., and then also for workplaces. I have a quote because Lord knows I love a good
Oh,
inspirational
me too.
quote. So I had to Google quotes on grief. That I wanted to find one that really struck a chord for me
okay.
and could maybe help us to reframe how we think about grief. And it's a really beautiful one. So here we go. I'll do my best to read it and do it justice. It says, grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. All of that unspent love gathers in the corner of your eyes, in the lump of your throat, and in the hollow part of your heart. Grief is just love with no place to go.
Yes.
So how beautiful is that?
Yes.
It's
Grief is just love and anger and frustration
Right.
and disappointment all together in terms
so
of
so
for
you're
me.
having this experience. How do we then channel it for some benefit? And that might sound inappropriate in some situations, but what I'm trying to say is if we're looking at it through this lens of grief as love,
Right.
and it's love that has nowhere to go because you've lost someone or you've lost the expectation of something that you loved. Because I'm even thinking like even if you loved a job and you
Yeah.
lost it.
Oh,
Oh, of
huge.
course,
That's huge.
especially there's actually statistics with men. I think it's over a certain age of like 42. If that career path, big promotion does not happen, that is a serious loss,
Right.
and it can really affect their whole family life. I mean, it can cause them to go on a trajectory and have like the midlife crisis, quote unquote.
Well, and we
Especially
have
if you've
to
worked those traditional 30-year positions,
we have to
right?
take this seriously
Right.
because
Mhm.
suicide rates are
I was
up.
going to say
And especially for
it's
men too.
a risk factor
It's
is any loss.
And so, even if it's this job that you've lost, but you loved it, it was so meaningful to you that it defined your day to day. Like,
Right.
how do you,
Even
what
the
do you
loss of a
do? What do you
promotion,
do
yeah.
with that love?
Right.
And what do you do with that loss? So that's going to take us into these conversations around restorative practices.
Right.
One thing we've spoken about before, and Jessica and I were talking about it before we started recording too, is when someone is having a really, really tough time, oftentimes basic needs are difficult.
Right.
It's difficult to sleep. It's difficult to feed yourself. It's difficult to shower and get dressed and put one foot in front of the other. So how do you then lean into these strategies that we're going to talk about that support the mind and body when it's difficult to do the basics?
Mhm.
I think that's a tough question to answer.
Right.
I know Lara is a huge proponent of helping people to craft a plan
Right.
for small steps to
Mhm.
take. How do you surround yourself with one or more or groups of people that can support you?
Right.
So I first want to acknowledge that depending on what someone's navigating and if there's other considerations at play, like a mental health diagnosis on top of it,
Right.
this could be very, very difficult for someone to implement.
Exactly.
That said, because it's a spectrum and because ideally we're helping people to get their basic needs met, we also want to encourage them to do some other things. Let's talk about what those other things might be.
I like to think of it as like, are they still in the ambulance stage? So
Right.
are we still making sure nothing's bleeding,
Triage.
physically,
Yes.
literally? Like, so if you're still not able to sleep, if you have such bad upset stomach that you're throwing up, you have diarrhea, you can't get any nutrients from the food that you are able to eat, if you
Right.
can't keep water down, then the immediate thing is just those needs. And unfortunately, that's usually right away whenever something's happened. And everyone around you, usually their first reaction is, can you please tell me everything that just happened?
Right. Or let me come over. And that person just
or
wants to
what
be
happened?
alone. Yeah.
What happened? What happened? What happened? Right? So it's a
Mhm.
very tough time. People want to do what they want to do to help you.
Right.
So you have to accept people on their level of where they're meeting you. But it's very important, if you're still not sleeping, if you still are not able to keep food and water down, that is the first step, that you have to stop all things and handle your own body first. That is the most important thing. No one else around you is going to be able to have your help if you hit the wall, which you will hit a wall physically, after shock. That's the beauty of shock.
So
is that it keeps
you
us
bring
awake.
up a good point because there are times where talking about something is helpful.
Mhm.
And I want to also acknowledge that there are times when not talking about something is helpful.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think if it's kind of low grade, non-emergent, talking it out might be helpful.
Right.
But if it's crisis,
Yes.
Yes.
emergent, you're still in that triage phase, that's where someone may not want to talk
Well,
about
they
it.
can't.
Yeah,
They
their
really
eyes are still
can't.
glassed over.
They're like prefrontal cortex, that thinking part of your brain, the reasoning, the rationality part of your brain, it goes offline. So then you
Right.
just function from emotion or even like just survival, like getting your basic needs met, like sleeping and eating and caring for yourself at the basic level. That's what you need to focus on first, because you physiologically can't communicate.
You can't process.
What
the
really struck a
information.
chord for me, though, was when Jessica said, you get hammered with questions.
Yes.
And I had one life situation that was very, very difficult. I was grieving some news,
Right.
and it was a situation that was evolving day by day by day. And so, because people, quote unquote, care, they want to know what's going on. They want to
Yeah.
know the latest news. And I said to my therapist at the time, I can't rehash this for every single person that wants an update.
Right.
Like, I am emotionally
Yeah.
exhausted. I can't keep talking about it.
And that's
so
re-traumatizing too.
we had to set a boundary, or I had to reframe how I handled it. And I just decided that instead of giving people the 5-minute answer, I gave them the 2-word answer.
Mm-hmm.
We're okay.
Yep.
That's all I'm able to share right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to be so careful when we do these kinds of episodes that there's not one best practice that fits for like every scenario,
Right.
right?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of variables at play.
I think it's important, though, to realize some of the do's and some of the don'ts when you are in a relationship and you're communicating with somebody going through a pretty significant loss, that there are some things that are recommended, like just saying, hey, I'm here for you. Silence is recommended. But what is not recommended is kind of saying things like, at least they went and they're not suffering, like things like that. Like, I think that there are some specific do's and don'ts.
I used to have a saying where it was accept information instead of asking information. Okay, so it's the A sec, not accept with an E,
Yeah.
with the A.
Right.
Accept information from someone. My father has died. Oh my goodness, are you okay? The person says, yeah, but I have to go here and there. Okay, that's the information you needed. Did you need to ask how? No.
Right.
Right? Or any other questions? Any questions? So accepting information, especially in the ambulance time, hey, these are all like A's, is important. And it's also just something that I think when you've gone through something like that, you know right away, yes, that's what I wish people had done.
Right.
Is just let me tell you what I'm ready to tell you now. And the person might pour more information into you. But if they don't, then you're accepting what they told you and you don't ask any more questions.
Right. I feel very strongly that there are times when yes or no questions are appropriate.
Right.
And there are times where yes and no questions maybe are not appropriate because you're trying to get someone sharing, but
Yes. But like when it's
but
just
when
a normal,
but there's a lot of times where those open-ended questions are not appropriate. I can think of so many examples to give, but I want to keep us moving forward.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit more specifically about mind-body practices.
Right.
We can talk about this, I think, simultaneously at the individual level and also at the workplace or organizational level. And so I'll take this back to many months ago. Jessica and I were actually talking about an idea we had for workplaces around grief and loss and change and major life events. And this is starting to trend in human resources. I'm seeing people talking about life events and what are we doing for people when a major life event happens. So anyways, Jessica and I were talking about this a while ago, saying like, what if there was support baked into the workplace? Like you just knew that if you were grieving the loss of a loved one, going through a divorce, healing from a miscarriage, whatever it is, you wouldn't need to explain what your life event was, but you could go to HR and say, I need support. I'm experiencing a life change or I'm grieving something, I need support. And then what would that look like? So that's where Jessica and I were headed. And we were talking about things like trauma-informed yoga.
Right.
We were talking about things like support groups and meditation and mindfulness and healing touch, things like Reiki or massage. And that could be a one-on-one experience. That could be a small group experience. So what all would you add to that?
I think often, or just like in the hospitals, there's more of a need for what they would almost call I guess what would be something cute to call it for this, like a healing host, right? Somebody that you can then go to that isn't a counselor, right? That isn't the therapist, that might not be the yoga teacher, that might not be the massage person, but somebody that can help them to navigate the phone calls that need to be made in order for that to happen.
An advocate.
An advocate for them. Yeah, a patient advocate. Exactly. Advocacy for patients, somebody that's, not a family member, because that pressure is put on a lot of family members as caregivers. And quite frankly, they're going through their own trauma from this trauma on their person that they love as well. So it's really not fair. Oftentimes maybe you don't have that already around you. It can be tough for, someone with a master's degree to keep track of somebody, and their schedule for help with appointments. It could definitely use just someone that says, here's the benefits you actually have that we have for you. Here's the way that we can get you into them, and let me help you make the phone call, as
And
opposed to them calling.
we're
Because-
doing some of that work already because Lara and I developed a program called ACT,
Right.
which stands for Advocate, Connect, and Teach.
Wonderful.
So advocate, meaning you can be a voice for the
Mhm.
person who is unable to speak, needs to heal.
Mhm.
We can teach healthy ways to cope in the short term until long-term support is in place, and connect to resources. I'm going in the wrong order as I
That's
explain
okay.
them, but that's
All right.
okay.
Yeah.
We know what you mean.
Yes, advocate, connect, and teach, because people need people.
Right.
I think I would like to tattoo that somewhere on my body.
Yeah.
Says the woman with no tattoos.
Yes.
People need people.
Yeah.
And I use this in my conversation with employers who are thinking about hiring me, but it's not just a sales pitch. Like
Right.
I mean it at the deepest level
Yeah.
that people need people. They don't need to be sent to an app.
Right.
And they don't need to be sent to a
Right.
1-800 number.
Yeah, oftentimes people can't advocate for themselves because
Correct.
they
Yes.
feel like they would never speak up for themselves oftentimes when they really need to, let
Yes.
alone in this
Mhm.
situation. So you have to have that person in your corner that's like,
Yes.
no, I don't care that you just got disconnected after waiting on hold for 10 minutes to the
Right.
provider that's from your insurance. I'm actually going to go back on hold for you. You can go and just have your rest of your day. And I'm going to make sure somebody answers my phone call today because I can press the other number that I'm a patient advocate, or something. Because I've had that personally happen to me. And there's nothing more upsetting than when you're in the most stressful situation of your life and you have to be the one no one else is doing it, right? Especially if it's not even for you, right? If it's for someone you're caring for
Mhm.
and you just don't have anyone else to help you.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
So we were talking about people need people. There are some ways that technology is connecting people to resources and therapy and
Mhm.
support and help sooner, right? Like you can text and get someone to respond and that type of thing. But sometimes in life, there are hoops that I think people have to jump through unnecessarily. And
Right.
what I had wanted to say, it's coming back to
Mhm.
me now, is that we oftentimes use hand holding as like a negative connotation, like, oh, so and so needs so much hand holding. And so I'm really trying to flip the interpretation of that
Right.
with our work to say we want to hold people's hand
Yes.
in the best way possible.
Yes.
Like, yes, you want people who are self-managers and, a little bit of self motivation and that type of thing when you're hiring candidates, right? Like you want some people with some great skill sets for your workplace, but we also want to hold their hand when they're going through something.
Right. And it's about building people up. And that's what I talk to my clients a lot is like focus on the people that not only are around you, but make you feel good, that build you up. And holding someone's hand, that's like the best gesture of compassion. Because it's not only empathy. You're not just saying, I understand. You're like, here, walk with me. I'm going to be your guide.
Right. One of the things that Lara says a lot that I really like and want to reiterate is what a beautiful goal it is to create a workplace where everyone feels like they have my back. They
Right.
being my colleagues, they being my boss, they being my manager. Like everybody has my back and I have theirs.
Mm-hmm.
can I give an example of when I
Yes.
first worked for you?
Yes.
Hannah got sick and I had to take her to an appointment or I had to be with her because of whatever had happened. And when I first called in, I was just that I needed a last minute sub. I was so worried. And your first question was, oh, is she okay? And that really just stopped me in my tracks because I really did. I was a little bit of an abused puppy when I came out of
Aw.
the other jobs I had. I was
Right.
always in hardcore sales, aspects and then working with doctors. So it was difficult, and a lot of the time as a trauma informed practitioner, you would be even hired by people that want you for that service, but then they're not practicing that in their own culture, workplace.
Yeah.
So here you are trying to be trauma informed with what you're providing for them, but then they are not doing that for you when you need it. So
Yeah.
And then especially, I mean, that's a whole other topic with women's needs and children being sick and all of those feelings like you couldn't have a full-time job. And, you did really fill in a huge gap to that population of people being able to work from home too, before it was COVID.
That's right.
Yes, you did.
We
yes,
were.
you did.
Yes, you did.
I see it too.
And it was good.
You're
It was a good
amazing.
one too. It wasn't any chump change.
So we were talking earlier about, when I say earlier, like before we pressed record. So let me fill you in. Jessica and I were talking about how difficult it is for some people, depending on their employer and what the policies are, to return to work following an event. We'll call it an event. Like whatever the major event was, there's some type of loss, some type of crisis, some type of trauma, some type of accident, something unexpected happens, and they go back to work. Sometimes they're asked to go back to work 2 days later.
Yes.
Right.
As short as 2 days for the loss of even your own child. Yeah. So you have to use FMLA, or you'd have to use all your PTO first. Sometimes it depends on the place. So that's what people do.
And so one of the things we were talking about before we started today is we may not have all the answers in this episode for this is how to fix this systemic problem, but we feel compelled to talk about it and open the conversation. And I think it's fair to say that we are simultaneously figuring it out with our clients.
Yes.
We're able to have some of these conversations with decision makers, which is really awesome. We've always been proponents of layering health and well-being directly into the workday. It's not this afterthought, like finish your workday, then go take care of yourself. Like we're really co-creating a very different workday with our clients, and we're having these conversations. And it's not just about taking care of their physical bodies, but also their social, emotional needs, their mental health. And
I don't think it has to be so black or white.
Yes.
So why do you only get 2 days off, but then you have to come back to your normal job responsibility? Why would we not make accommodations?
an adaptive
So, hey,
approach.
they're really not in the mood, or, they should have time to just maybe be in the back where they don't talk to as many
Yes.
people, or they can provide this, or they can come in for half a day for
That's a
a
great
while.
point. Mhm.
I mean, there's ways, just like we would adapt for anyone with a disability,
Yes.
right? In that way, for that short period of time, we don't see the bandages on this loss or whatever, but it's there. So why not just, and I know so many people do not want to take 2 weeks off in the middle of a huge loss either, because it's too much time off, right? You
'Cause
don't want that
routine-
much time
yeah.
to, but then going back fully can be a way to just quickly hit a wall.
Yeah.
So why can't we just meet in the middle somewhere and let them adapt and tell you,
Right.
I would love to come in 3 hours a day this next week. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I love what you're saying, that
Me too.
And then it's individualized for those people, and
Yes.
you can handle it with those people based on that person, not a
Yeah.
general rule.
And this really jives with what we know about workplace wellness, that it's not a one size fits all. There's not
Exactly.
only one way to do things. It's important to be able to have these conversations and be in the moment and handle things
Yes.
mindfully to the best of your ability in the moment, given the situation, and to be fair. And
Yes.
one thing that we've been talking about at length in our trainings all year long is that fair means that it looks different
For different people.
for different
Exactly.
for different
The
people in different
accommodations that you need.
scenarios.
Exactly.
We just need to be fair.
Yes.
And employees want that. They don't want the same for everybody because they
Sure.
understand, they see it. They don't want the same. They want employers to really adapt and be more integrative in their approach.
And I think it is a more safe way of handling it than making blanket rules, because sometimes one of the worst things I've seen happen with that is where they do try to say, well, if it's just your grandma, it's 2 days.
Oh.
But if it's your daughter, we'll give you this. Well,
Yeah.
quite frankly, you can't make that judgment call on that person's loss. And that's where people, you can't say that person needing a week slow start back to work for their grandma is a bad thing for them. Right? That's where the training comes in.
Mm-hmm.
That we don't say, oh, you only get 2 days for that because you must have seen that one coming. right?
Right.
Because we don't know what the loss effect is for that person.
Exactly.
It's truly individualized to everyone, and we're not judging how they're handling it. It's truly without judgment, and we're meeting them where they are.
Right.
I think some of the fear with this is that people will milk the system, correct? But if you
We have to start
system,
trusting people.
Right.
and if exactly, and quite frankly, especially in this part of the country, people do not milk the system. A lot of the time, people who could, they say it's a free class if you don't have the money. They still pay that $5 donation. Nobody wants to be the one to totally go in there for free most of the time, in my belief. But again, if you're handling it individually, if that seems to be the case with this person, perhaps they need more help with some other problem that's causing it.
Correct.
But then you would handle it from there.
And another interesting point is that when you're in grief, that you sometimes don't know what to expect. Like things come at you, you handle it differently than you ever thought would be the way you handle a loss. Like the way you adapt and
Correct.
stuff is completely
Sometimes
different.
people don't know what they need.
Right.
Yes.
Wow. So we are at that time where we wrap up, because I think we could go on and on so many different meaningful topics related to this. So my hope is that we are opening a conversation to create a different experience for our loved ones and our colleagues and our workplaces and our workday. So please tune in again to future episodes where we'll continue to explore hot topics, things we're passionate about, things we are really trying to be proactive about integrating into the workplace and the workday, and helping people to feel their personal and professional best. And if you have feedback for us on what you would like to hear and learn more about, that's powerful too. So with that, we are complete, and we will see you, or I guess you will hear us is a better way to say it, soon. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.